welcome to another episode of the Intelligent Content Academy tutorial series, where we teach you how to use tools and technologies that help you transform your content into intelligent content. I'm Marcelo Lewin, a content architect and the founder of Intelligent Content Academy. If you want to get a hold of me for any reason, just email me, marcelo@intelligentcontent.academy. Now, I'm extremely happy for today's episode. I've got a special guest presenter. Her name is Alison Cossette. She's the developer advocate at Neo4j, and she's going to show us or introduce us actually into GraphRAG, covering all about it, what it is, how it works. And then we're going to jump into how enterprises can generate business insights that are grounded on their data. So it's going to be a really interesting session today. So I'm very happy for this. But before we get started, you know how this works. Don't forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel. Click that bell icon to get notified when a new episode is out. And if you enjoyed this episode, hit the like button. If you didn't, send me an email and tell me why. All right, with that said, let's go ahead and get Alison in here. Alison, welcome.
Hey, Marcelo, great to see you. Thank you so much for having me.
Glad to have you here. I'm happy you're here. You're a great presenter. You've done some great presentations, so I appreciate you being here. Before we jump into the actual presentation, why don't you give us a little bit about your background?
Sure. So, as you mentioned, I'm a developer advocate at Neo4j, where we specialize in graph databases and graph structures. I'm a longtime fan of network theory and network structures. And so, for me, it's just been a really great opportunity to take that love of graph and networks and take it out into the community and show folks how they can leverage it to move their own enterprises forward.
Now, prior to Neo4j, what did you do?
Oh, so before Neo4j, I've been in data science for a really long time. So I've done a lot of education. I've worked for different universities, taught boot camps. I've worked in market research. I started out actually in healthcare because I
Oh,
had been a practitioner. I worked in like an occupational therapy area and made that transition into healthcare data science because I wanted to help many patients at once instead of just the one patient I could see in the room at the time.
very cool. Now, we're
Yeah.
going to jump into your presentation real quick, but I love to always get to know people on a personal level. So, what do you do? I know you travel a lot, right? Because part of your job is
I do.
traveling and doing a lot of presentations. What do you
Yes.
do to wind down and relax?
Um, Honestly, just be home with my family is one of my favorite things. It sounds really silly, but having the family at the dinner table is really one of my great joys. But the other thing is traveling with my family is even better. We've got a family trip coming up out to California next month, and we're all very much looking forward to that.
Oh, to California. Where are you going to go?
We are going to a Notre Dame USC game. My boys are
Oh,
big football fans, and they've never
you're going to
seen
be
Notre
around my
Dame,
town.
so yeah.
You
So we'll
definitely
be
need
right
to
out
send me
there.
an email. Maybe I can, meet you for coffee or something.
Oh, that
It'll
would
be
be great.
it'll be
I would
great
love
to
it.
meet you in person. All right, people didn't tune in
Excellent.
for this. We can have a
No.
conversation for a lot longer, but we're going to go ahead and jump in. We can see your presentation. For those of you that
Excellent.
have any questions, go ahead and just put them on the chat, and I'll jump in and ask Allison. But Allison, I'll let you get started, and then I'll jump in with any questions.
Great. So, just so everyone is grounded in what we're going to be covering today, we're going to be talking about the enterprise knowledge graph and how you can use that to build a good data set. Then we'll talk a little bit about how tracking your conversations, say in a chatbot, can help you gain some insights. And then finally, we'll look at some maintenance tools. So the first portion is going to be more general and giving you an idea of what is a graph and how does that work for your business. And then we'll get into some more of the technical pieces about what it looks like in practice. Alrighty, so let's move on here. So, what we're talking about today specifically is around GraphRAG, and RAG stands for Retrieval Augmented Generation. And you might say, Allison, what is that? So, when we talk about generative AI applications, folks are familiar with, say, a chat GPT. The way that it works is you'll put in your prompt, you'll ask your question, then chat GPT, for as an example, would give you an answer. But I will tell you, ChatGPT and LLMs are good at many, many things, but they're not always great at information, and they're certainly not knowledgeable about your information. And so, what RAG does is it allows you to augment that response with your specific data from your area. So, for example, here we have the user prompt. It asks the Gen AI application, your ChatGPT. Then there's an additional step where you actually go out and connect to your data source. So it will take whatever is the relevant information in your enterprise, bring it back with the LLM, and give you this answer. So that's what we see here. The LLM plus the relevant information gives you this more complete and curated response. And so you'll see this. You may have heard of things like vector databases and databases where it takes the language and makes it available mathematically to say what's in the realm of the question that I'm asking, what information might be relevant. And those things do a really great job. But what we know about our business is that our business isn't just one thing and another. It's very much about what is the context around it, what is the business domain. If I ask any individual in a company a question, they're bringing in a lot of different contexts of what they know about the organization, not just that one question. So, how do we get the real knowledge and the intelligent content out of our content? How do we do that? What we want to look at now is we want to look at what is the data that you're making available. So we talked a little bit about vector databases and unstructured data. A lot of folks right now are seeing ways that you can talk to your PDFs or talk to your documents. But you also have lots of structured data in your business. You have customer information. You have product transaction histories. Maybe you have some semi-structured data. So throughout the enterprise, you talk to any of your information architects, you have a number of different types of data sources. But how do you make all of that knowledgeable and intelligent? And what we suggest is you look at the idea of the knowledge graph, which is this superset data structure that you can use for your retrieval augmented generation. And so you might be saying, Allison, like, okay, this is all really well and good, but how does this actually connect? Like, what does this mean to my business? What does this knowledge graph look like? So, what I want to do first is just explain what each of the components of a graph are. The first thing that we have is we have something called a node, which represents an entity of some kind. It can be, generally, we say it's a noun. So, for example, a person or a car might be an entity that you have. But those entities have relationships. So, if we think of a table of people, there are relationships among those people, right? Person A knows person B, they know each other. Person B maybe rents a room from person A. But then we also see that there's a car in question. Maybe one person owns the car, maybe another person drives the car. The last piece that we have is when we start thinking about our data, you're like, okay, well, we've got these things, but there's a lot more depth of information. So, for example, we've got this first person. Andre has a birth date and a Twitter handle. Micah has a birth date. Maybe we don't know her Twitter handle or X handle. Maybe she doesn't have one. So each of these entities, as well as the relationships, have properties associated with them. So, for example, in the person driving, with Andre driving the Volvo, we can see when he's been driving it since. The other thing to note is that within the node car, we can see that there's a description. There are some unstructured properties associated with that particular entity. Underneath that, we also see that there's an embedding, and the embedding is the mathematical representation of the language that's in the description. So, what I want to make clear here is that when we start thinking about a knowledge graph, the knowledge graph really brings all of those tables to life. So when we step back and we start thinking about the business itself, we know that our business is always constantly moving and changing. The nature of any sort of transactional data or enterprise data, it's always being generated and it's always moving. Our business is very agile. But our data is in these rows and columns. So as I was saying, we've got people column, but there are relationships among those people. we have a product column, but we know certain products are often sold together. So, how do we really extract those patterns and the real knowledge and that intelligence of these rows and columns in a way that's more representative of what's happening within the business enterprise? Because these patterns and the connections among them, this is where you've got so much hidden information and intelligence. So I'm going to take a step back and really invite you to start thinking about the nature of your business. We call this the seven graphs of the business. And we're going to look at each one of them. But we know just from the way we do business that products are associated with suppliers, customers purchase products. Maybe customers have transaction. There's a process. We've got network security. We have internal organization, say employee or operational information. And when we think about our business, right, any of the CEOs or the managers, you're always managing that complex network of how the business actually works. We sometimes talk about being data driven, but it's actually we're context driven. We make a decision about a product, it's going to impact a customer. We have a new customer base, it may impact which products we offer. And so starting to understand the relationships among them puts us in this elevated position of not being data driven, but being context driven. So let's take a little bit dive into some of these. When we think about the interconnected area around the customer, we have information about the customer, we've got payments they've made, we've got history of their transactions. And some of the things we see around the customer is, can we use this context to make recommendations? How does this fit with loyalty programs or churn prevention? All of these different interconnected pieces are really going to impact how we view and how we leverage the customer. We think about network and security data, account identity control, reputation scoring, threat detection. For any given network and security, you're going to have different assets that may need certain controls. You may have locations of servers or infrastructure. You want to look at the access patterns, who's accessing which different information. And so you can naturally start to see the network of interactions of different people with different data sources, right? When we think of our employee data, we have the person's role, their skills, the actual employee. But let's think about career management. If we look at someone's previous role and their next role, you can see that that's very linear, and that is that connection of potential pathways. We can see who their managers are or who their teams are, which teams are successful based on those different kinds of connections. So we can look at that a little bit. We think about the transaction area of the enterprise, payments, products, customers, invoices. There are certain things that come out in patterns, so anti-money laundering. If we think about a single payment, if we think about a table of payments, determining whether any single payment is fraudulent or not can be very challenging. Anyone who's ever built a fraud detection model will know that. Very few elements are fraudulent. So how do we surface those? Some of the ways that we do it is by looking at the series of payments or where something has occurred. I know in one a famous example that we used, they actually tracked that money was moving in a circular manner. So by tracking the payments and their connections to each other, they could see that that money was being filtered around. The last area we want to talk about is product reviews, inventory, recommendations, and pieces like that. The one place where sometimes people actually start is with their supply chain. Supply chain naturally is very networked. So if you think even about yourself and your traversals, if you're using a Waze or Google Maps or Apple Maps, when you have your route options, right? There are different pathways, there are different connections through these nodes and the relationships or the entities from, say, this exit to that exit. And so supply chain is a place where often enterprises will start is by putting their supply chain information into graph. What I generally say is what you want, where you want to start is the place where you're having either the biggest challenge or where it's really clear that relationships matter. Like I said, supply chain. If you're working on product sales and you're thinking about market basket, if you have a situation where you have lots of many to many relationships, right? Different things like that are often really good places to start. But we definitely always suggest starting with like one area first and growing out from there. Yes, you've got processes, automations, different ways of doing business that can have different sorts of impacts. So what I want you to get from this moment is the meta understanding that our business is dynamic, our business is interconnected, and in any given moment, how can I leverage this connection to provide more context to what we're doing? So that's the overview of graph in the business. And what we want to talk about now is we want to talk about specifically graph as it relates to retrieval augmented generation. So some of the things that come up when we start working with chatbots and Gen AI is people say, well, I've got all of this data, I've got all of these PDFs in our Google Drive, but not everybody has access to all of those. So there are ways that you can use the knowledge graph to sort of address different types of governance. So for example, we've got a customer service person and we have a doctor, right? The customer service person may need the phone, say they're at a particular area of the hospital or an organization, and they should have access to say the phone number of a person and their patient's name, but we don't want them to have access to the health diagnosis. By having this interconnected ability, you can add a layer of governance through the knowledge graph, right? You can build constraints on the different nodes and relationships. So only some information is visible to the appropriate party. The other really important thing in leveraging this knowledge graph layer is that explainability is really, really important in AI and particularly in generative AI. When we think of using ChatGPT, initially you would ask a question and it would give you an answer. Now you can ask it to say, oh, give me the reference where that came from. Show me which website you used to give me that answer. And that needs to apply to your enterprise data as well. If I'm in, say, sales and I'm trying to figure out who in our database I should talk to about this new product that's coming out, I'm going to want to know why it's recommending that customer or why is it recommending this product to that customer. So being able to trace through these connections is a really important piece of any of your generative AI and your modern AI systems.
Real quick, let's talk about
Yeah,
explainability here because it's a very
sure.
important concept to get down because it's not so much about transparency, but it's more about how did it come to that answer, right? Because
Exactly.
knowing that builds trust in the users of the enterprise, which then enables more usage of this AI technology, correct?
Exactly. I mean, trust is, it'd be silly not to acknowledge that in the terms of AI right now, we often hear that, robots are going to kill humanity or it's going to
Right.
take away everybody's jobs. And those fears are real and those perceptions are real. And what we have a responsibility as providers of AI tools as the enterprise is to have this explainability. So sometimes you'll see things like, why was I shown this ad? And you can dive in and say, oh, I was shown this ad because you also liked this ad, or different things like that. You'll get some underpinnings of that recommendation. And the explainability is important not only to the customer, but when we think about the enterprise itself, we're
Right.
looking at introducing AI tools as part of your workflow. you need to have buy-in from your employees about, yes, this is a valid tool to be using. Yes, I can rely on this as part of my workflow. So think of a physician. A physician gets a recommendation for, a particular type of treatment, or whether someone should be, discharged to home or to a rehab facility. You need to have some really clear explanations for that
Right.
individual to even leverage that tool. We certainly don't want enterprises investing in AI that their people aren't going to use, right? And we've seen that. So that explainability is as important to your B2C as it is within your internal systems as well.
And it may be a compliance issue, like let's say with EU um, regulations. For example, if you deny somebody a loan, you better be able to explain how the AI came to that conclusion. Why did you deny the loan, to make sure there wasn't any bias or anything like that, right? I just wanted to emphasize this
100%.
because I feel like this is a very important part of building trust in all our AI tools.
Yeah, and I was actually just in Washington earlier this week at the GovAI Summit, and we were talking folks through from this vendor perspective what the newest requirements are. And the government mandate right now is that privacy officials and civil liberty officials, all of these folks need to be at the very beginning part of that AI acquisition
Right.
conversation, because we do need to understand what these impacts are. And what's great about a knowledge graph, and I'm going to show you one example right now, is you can actually trace that explainability. You can trace that logic, and you can trace it in a way that's very easy to interpret. Because what we have to recognize is that the AI tools we are using now, it's not just the data scientists and those of mathematicians who have, for the last 10 or 15 years, have been sitting in a dark room somewhere,
Right.
like building all these things out with our understanding. You need to provide tools where any individual within your organization can see that explainability and can have confidence.
Yeah,
So the
definitely.
example I have on the screen now is an example of how do we use this semantic and this natural language understanding to actually use this knowledge graph traversal to get to an action or an insight. So what we see on the left-hand side is this is a product, right? And we see that we've got a product and it's a variant of these other products. So we've got something new and it's related to this first row of orange products, right? The next column we see is the customers. So these are all of the customers that purchased products that are similar to that. Then what we look at is we say, oh, we have another customer who hasn't purchased that category of product, but has purchased a lot of other products that are like similar, or they're also purchased by these people. So, maybe the first column is all maybe cat products, or then this third column is, I don't know, like cat costumes or whatever it may be. And we can say, oh, well, we've got this other customer who isn't directly connected to this category, but is very likely, because of the commonalities with these other customers, a good target for this particular product. And when we think about internally, like I was mentioning earlier in the sales cycle, maybe you have customers who have purchased, certain parts of your software, and they also purchase this other thing. So you'll see sometimes, like in your Amazon, people who purchase this also likely purchase these other things. And this is where that knowledge graph comes into play. This is where we start thinking about market basket. And if we had a column of customers, this customer might not come up because this new product, they've never purchased anything like it before. But similar to in your LinkedIn, when you've got your first level contacts and your second level contacts, the idea of, oh, well, you have a lot of people in common, so maybe you know this other person, right? So what we're looking at here is we're looking at the semantic search, which is the natural language similarity, and using that along with the structured data that we have to traverse through the graph to come up with something actionable and insightful. So, what does this actually mean from a GraphRAG perspective? So, like we said, we have this prompt here. It goes through ChatGPT, and then what we do is we come back with this retrieval system. And so, the retrieval system, rather than coming up with just what's like semantically similar by language, we're going to add in this traversal, and we're going to add in these like additional connections, and all of that is going to come into the relevant results. So it's not just the other product documents, but it's whatever that traversal is that's going to be important. A couple of things that it allows you to do is it gives you more context and reference. It makes that explainability human readable, right? We talked about that. Trust in these systems has to be easy to understand. That opaqueness will really block the success of your AI applications. And lastly, with Neo4j and with the knowledge graph, we've spent a lot of time building out the libraries, building out the modules so that you can leverage this in this semantic layer in faster ways. So this just gives you the overview of what GraphRAG actually is. So to get back to the earlier question of, okay, like Alison, this sounds great, but what do I actually do? How does this work? Where should I begin? What we want to start thinking about is you want to start with a data set that is going to be what we call a high quality data set. And what does that mean? It means that for the problem that you're solving, the data that you have is very relevant. What we mean by that is if I'm building, let's just say, I've got a challenge with employee onboarding, and we're finding that people don't know where to get access to different pieces. So you want to make sure that if you're going to build, say, a chatbot for employee onboarding, you want to make sure you have all the relevant documents, right? The other thing is you want to make sure that it really is augmenting the knowledge of the large language model. And these things seem redundant, but it's more about really knowing that you have the data that's going to solve the question being asked. And as we go through, I'm going to give you some ideas of like how to know whether you have that. Initially, we're going to suggest you go to your subject matter expert and say, what is the domain? What is the information that we need? The next piece is that you want it to be really reliable. And what we mean by reliable is some of the things that come up with reliable is, um, are there many versions of something? Do you have outdated employee manuals? Do you have conflicting documents, right? I mean, I, I think it's safe to say that on any given piece of messaging, whether internal or external, somewhere in your enterprise, you have two documents that probably have some conflict. So you want to make sure that what is being retrieved is always going to be giving that optimal and most current answer. The next thing we talk about is we talk about it being really clean. And this is where sometimes people get really challenged when they're talking about their unstructured data. So, are you bringing in something that's really tidy? And your data science team is really going to be some good folks to rely on here because we've got years of experience cleaning data and making it AI ready. So you really want to make sure that that's tidy. The other thing that's going to come up is efficiency. And what we mean by efficiency is the nature of copy and paste, the nature of having multiple versions of the same thing is really common throughout the enterprise. I like to think of, in our case, we built something I'll share a little bit with you about where we took all of our documentation, specifically on the graph data science area that we were working on within the company. And what we found is that and I'll show you how we surface this, but there's some language that repeats on many pages through our documentation. If I'm asking a system to bring me back the most relevant items and I ask for 10 documents, it doesn't help me if all 10 documents are like carbon copies of the same thing. So we want it to be really efficient. You want to make sure that you have the right data that's going into this data set.
Sorry to interrupt you again there, but real quick
Please,
on
I
that,
love
because
the
I think it's an
interruption.
important point that you brought up. You talked about nodes and objects and thinking. It's the same thing with the content to keep it clean. Part of that really is to convert into structured content with components, right, that are reusable and provide single source of truth, because then you get this clean, efficient outcome that you're looking for here. So I'm not saying that you have to
Yeah.
change everything in your company, but if you start thinking in single source of truth and components as opposed to just strings, right? Um,
Yes.
or yeah, just strings like things, not strings, right? As Google said,
Yes.
right? Start thinking
Yeah.
in those terms, then you will automatically start getting this clean, efficient. I just wanted to bring that up, and I don't know if there's anything you'd like to add to that as well.
Yeah, no, and I'm going to show you some ways that you can. Part of this exercise today is where we get into the technical pieces. Is how
Right.
do you actually find that in your data and how do you suss that out? Um, and again, it's things like if I've got a piece of documentation, having it tied to a metadata node of, say, version. So then when I'm querying the graph, I say, oh, I want only the things that are related to version 214, or only the things that are related to, maybe you have your employee data, your employee handbook, and it's done by year. Like, oh, give me what was true in 2023 or what's going to be true in the 2025 handbook. So, this idea of being able to filter the graph and really get to what you want is part of why having that graph structure, and as you mentioned, Marcelo, having those components tied to that piece is really important in having this really quality generative AI application within your GraphRAG system.
Definitely. Yep. I'll let you continue that.
Yeah. Yeah. So the one thing that I want to do, and we'll get into like leverage, diving into the database a little bit, but we want you to consider is actually logging your conversations when you're building these chatbots and you're building these RAG applications. And sometimes people will question us like, oh, is that ethical? There are certainly ways, depending on what the nature of your use case is, where you can anonymize and do different pieces. But ultimately, the business insight is going to come from the way the application is leveraged. If you think about product analytics in general, your mix panel or your click tracking in your software, how people are using your product tells you a lot about what it's doing. And what we want to talk through really quickly today, not too quickly, is how people are talking with your data, what it can tell you. So this is an idea of the graph, and we have something called Agent Neo, which is the chatbot that we have internally on our systems. And I just want to show you the entities that we are using in this very straightforward piece of like tracking. So we see that we have the session all the way on the left. That session is the user logging in. That within that, the user has a conversation, and then the user has the message, which is the prompt. It has a question. That question then, as we say, goes out, retrieves that context, and has a response. And each of those pieces that it's pulling in is related to a particular source. So the connection of the conversation is I put in a message, it goes out and retrieves some documents, gives me an answer. I have my next question or my follow up response. It goes out, gets documents, give me this answer back. So that's the nature of logging and what we're looking at. So, what does that actually look like in practice? So, here we see we have the user, we have this conversation. The light pings that go through the middle are the call and response or the prompt and response. So, this is the user prompt, the system response, user prompt, system response. And what we're seeing in these darker pinks are the actual pieces of information from your RAG system that are getting pulled in to the conversation. And one of the things that, again, I always, with these types of visualizations, encourage you to look at them with what I call the soft eye. And what we see when we look at it in the soft eye is it's pulling in 10 different documents. And from the first answer to the second answer, only about half of the documents are still relevant. And what that shows is that shows how the conversation is changing from one area of information to another. So the numbers on here just are different areas of the conversation. But what we want you to think through is if you can just take a minute to imagine all of the data that you have, all the different types of information you have. Again, let's just say we go with an employee handbook, right? So maybe someone is asking a question about general travel expenses. And then their follow up question is on travel expenses as it relates to hotels. So obviously, there's going to be some information that's still relevant for both questions, but there's new information that comes up with the next conversation. And this is where we start to say that the business insight starts to make itself known, because you can start to see how people not only are, like I said, in the product analytics, how they're working through your product or through or maybe it's through their purchase history, right? You're in consumer goods, their purchase history. But what we want you to see is how are people thinking about your product? How are people thinking about your enterprise? What is the chain of thought that comes up? And so you can imagine that each of these conversations is going to travel through the information that you have in different ways. And so there's that aspect that's the first business insight that you can get from having this type of a RAG application. The next thing that we offer is looking at conversational length. Now, conversation length, whether you want it to be longer or shorter, and conversation length, we mean how many prompts and responses. If you are in, like, if you're in HR, you want someone to get in and get their answer and get out pretty quickly. So you want that really fast turnaround. So those conversations, you may want them to be pretty short. I recently was in a chat. I travel a lot, as Marcelo mentioned. I was in a chat with United Airlines about something, about changing a flight. And, that's another situation where it might take a modest amount, but you don't want it to go on too long either. Or maybe you've got something where it's like a different kind of interaction. Say it's, like my son will sometimes do chats with he's learning Spanish, and we'll do chats to sort of understand and have conversations. And those conversations, you want those to be longer because you want those. So when you're looking at conversational length, really think about what is the use case? How soon do I want someone to get to an answer? Is my driver to retain engagement, or is my driver to give someone an answer and have it lead to an action? So conversation length is a really important metric and business insight for your application. Sometimes you want to look at response times, and this is definitely much more on the technical side and from a maintenance perspective. How long does it take to get that retrieval? And that can sometimes speak to your conversation memory. So this is going to be more for your application builders, just making sure that you're getting fast responses. And this is what I was saying earlier too, is the visualizing the context document usage. In this particular instance, what we're seeing is the light pinks are the documents that are relevant to these responses, and the darker pinks are the actual like conversations. And again, looking at it at a soft eye, what you see is you see a lot of concentration sort of in the middle and in the bottom. There's a lot of interconnection of different documents and answers. And then there are some ancillary, which are the pieces that don't come up as much. And what this is going to tell you is this is going to give you an idea of the density of where the conversations are happening. What are the topics that people really want to talk about? And this is where you want to make sure that it's going to reveal what are the highly relevant documents to your constituents or whomever is using this product. And again, it goes back to doing some analysis on it and say, oh, we see a lot of people are asking about, these different types of concepts, and these are happening a lot. They're really interconnected. So there's a lot of like heat happening here. And again, depending on your use case, is it that folks are asking about, tax compensation? Is it that they're asking about, how to get to Premier 1K for the year in their travel systems, whatever it may be. Looking at this interconnectedness and these the algorithms we would use are called centrality, but that's going to give you a lot of insight as to what's happening and what are people learning and using. So these business insights, actually, a lot of them come out of the way that this generative AI application is being used and really looking at what it looks like live and in action is going to tell you so many interesting things. It'll also tell you a little bit about your data set. So one of the things that you can look at is which are the pieces that come up the most. This is happens to be ours, and something that comes up a lot is centrality algorithms, something that I just mentioned. So looking at what comes up most often, what are people looking at? You can look at communities and similar documents to figure out what kinds of things people come up with the most. In our case, the most frequent documents came from our documentation, which makes sense. But our second most frequent was a series of blogs from one of our experts. And so, again, understanding people are asking about these particular issues. People are asking about these things. So, really looking at what is being served back in the application is going to tell you so much, excuse me, about how people are interacting with your system and what is relevant to them. So the last couple of things that we want to look at is one thing to be mindful of is these analytics can also tell you where you've got a gap or there's a problem in your data set, right? So one of the things that we see, I know there's a lot of numbers on this page, but if we stay over here on the right, I want you to look at how many bad ratings compared to good ratings. And we can clearly see that most of the time the good far outweighs the bad. But in this last community of questions, we can see that we're not getting very good ratings. For a ratio of 4 to 5 of bad to good, which means about half of the responses from that area, people aren't happy with the answer. So in that case, you say, okay, let me go in and look at those documents. Are they out of date? Is it that people aren't getting the answers that they're looking for? Is it that they're asking a question and we just don't have the answer in it? And this is the closest thing, but it's not really answering the question. Sometimes you'll see on websites like, did this answer your question, yes or no? So that's another way that you can get these analytics of maybe there's some product information or something that you're missing. So, in summary, what we want you to come away with is that the semantic layer of understanding of your business is really important to your Gen AI applications and specifically to your RAG applications. You need a really high quality data set, and so much of understanding the business insight is looking at the interactions and that interpretability of those traversals that's really going to give you the insight as to what does this actually mean for our business. A lot of times right now, what we're seeing in the news and what we're seeing with customers and people are saying, we have all these Gen AI applications, but where's the ROI? These are the places that you can start to look at the ROI. And these are the places where you can find where there might be some opportunities for innovation, where there's some opportunity to find new target customers or new, potential insights are going to be from this graph layer of the data, of your enterprise data, but just as importantly, in the way people interact with that data.
That's awesome. That was great. So, and I know this is a simplification of everything you just said, but to kind of
Yeah.
simplify it, RAG lets you augment and ground your information, whereas GraphRAG does that and allows you to connect the dots in your organization so then you can really start generating insights. Because one just gives you
Yes.
that grounding, the other one lets you do the insights, correct?
Yeah, I mean, and one of the examples we use is we use SEC data, right? And so we've got 10K filings, and then you can see the company, but then you look at the asset managers of who are the asset managers that own those companies. So if I ask a question about, which companies are affected or by a lithium shortage, I can get that, right? From RAG, you can say, oh, well, these 10Ks all mention lithium. But being able to traverse over to which asset managers own those companies. Then you can say, oh, well, these own the most companies that mention that piece. So you can add that structured or that calculation aspect into these natural language answers. So you can query that structured data as well as your unstructured data.
Yep,
It's super
definitely.
exciting, at least to
Yeah,
me.
it is to me as well, and to our audience. It was great presentation, Allison. You did a fantastic job. Thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate you being here.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Marcelo. If anybody needs to find me, I'm really easy to find. LinkedIn is always a really fast way. You're also welcome to email me, allison.cossette@neo4j.com. But I just want to say I'm really glad that you had me on because I love what you're doing with Intelligent Content Academy. I love your content, and I'm just happy that I was able to contribute to what you have going on here.
Thank you, and you just took my content to the next level by being here. So thank you so. No, and I really mean it. I really mean it because I've been following you for a while, and you got some really cool stuff out there. So everybody should go check it out. Definitely go to LinkedIn and check it out. Find you there, like you said. But again, Allison, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
And thanks to the rest of you. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode. I know I enjoyed just listening to all her knowledge. It was just amazing stuff. So, if you need any help transforming your content into intelligent content, please feel free to reach out to me, Marcelo at intelligentcontent.academy. Also, all that YouTube stuff, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click that bell icon to get notified when a new episode is out. And if you enjoyed this episode, hit the like button. If you didn't, definitely send me an email and tell me why. And finally, when you have a moment, go to the website, intelligentcontent.academy, to learn how to transform your content into intelligent content. So until the next episode, cheers, everybody.